Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. And for those watching a recorded version of the webinar, thank you for joining us at a later time. So my name is Jason Q. I'm the Senior Managing Attorney in our Nonprofit and Small Business Legal Assistance Programs here at the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. And I am excited to talk to you today about starting a nonprofit organization and specifically focusing in on how to define the mission and purposes of a 501c3 nonprofit organization within the requirements set out by the IRS and the Internal Revenue Code governing nonprofit organizations. So we're going to learn about the range of permissible missions, purposes, and activities for nonprofits, and we're going to learn about some of the nuances and limitations within some of those categories and some of the prohibited purposes or activities that might be relevant to your organization. So a few housekeeping notes: if you're joining us live, you can get a download of the slides under the handouts tab of your GoToWebinar client. If you're watching a recorded webinar, just check the site where you're accessing the recording, and there should be a direct link to download the slides as well. A little bit more information about the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. In our nonprofit legal assistance program, we host training courses, webinars, and podcasts on important relevant legal issues facing nonprofits. We sponsor legal clinics and brief advice services to connect you with actual attorneys for low barrier assistance and education. We have a library of on-demand learning materials on our website, which is here, lawhelp.org/DC/NPSB. And for nonprofits based in DC and or serving DC communities, we do match nonprofit organizations with pro bono legal counsel to provide ongoing legal support on larger projects. That could include things like governance, IRS compliance, employment law, real estate matters. We also have that match program available for startup nonprofits that are eligible. So please look into that if you're interested. Okay. Let me get into an outline of today's webinar. So we're going to start with a little bit of legal background. I'm going to spend a lot of time defining what charitable purposes are for a nonprofit organization. That's because the charitable purpose is the broadest and most expansive and most nuanced category of nonprofit organization. So we're going to spend a lot of time diving into the various aspects of that category. Then we'll spend a little bit of time in the other major categories like religious purposes, educational purposes, and then we'll summarize some of the prohibited activities and sort of considerations that limit your nonprofit purpose. I call it a summary because just by going through the examples that we're going to hit today, we will cover a lot of the kind of limitations and considerations organically through that process. For those of us joining live, I would love to hear any questions that you might have in the chat. There is a questions field that you can drop questions into. I will check that periodically. If I'm going through an example or a concept and it touches on something you've been thinking about as a prospective nonprofit founder, please don't hesitate to drop your example in, and maybe we can have a kind of back and forth. Okay. So let's do a little legal background. Again, the focus of today's training is on 501c3 nonprofits. These are public charities, and they can also be private foundations. I want to mention this up front because there are other types of nonprofits like welfare organizations or trade associations, other kinds of organizations in different parts of the tax code like C4, C6, that have different limitations on what their purposes can be that are not within the scope of today's presentation. So today we're just focusing on C3 nonprofits, which are the most common type of nonprofits that we see through our organization. 501c3s are eligible for a number of publicly subsidized benefits and funding opportunities. I think most critically, they are generally exempt from income tax, and donations to 501c3s can be tax deductible for the donor. So these are sort of some of the core benefits of a 501c3. We have a whole separate before you start webinar all about understanding the benefits and limitations of a 501c3 nonprofit if you'd like more information about those benefits. As a condition of these great tax benefits and our tax exemption, 501c3s must be organized and operated exclusively for a valid tax-exempt purpose, or sometimes we'll just call it an exempt purpose, and cannot serve private interests. They must serve public interests, not private interests. Organized exclusively for an exempt purpose means that your governing documents, like your articles of incorporation and your bylaws, dedicate you exclusively to furthering one or more exempt purposes, and your governing documents cannot explicitly authorize you to engage in substantial non-exempt activities. Operated for exempt purposes means that in practice and on an ongoing basis, your organization actually only engages primarily in exempt purpose activities. Where does this show up? Well, first and foremost, as you'll see by that organized component, your governing documents like your articles and your bylaws will need to state the tax-exempt purpose that your nonprofit is dedicated to. So right from the beginning of the formation process, you'll need to be thinking about what that tax-exempt purpose is and ideally articulating it in a way that is cognizable to the IRS and that sort of checks the IRS's boxes with respect to that particular tax-exempt category that you're gonna plan on operating under. If you're filling out the Form 1023 to actually apply for 501c3 status, you'll be asked to give a lot more programmatic information about what you plan on doing to kind of bolster the fact that you fit within the tax code's definition of a 501c3 nonprofit. It's a little simpler if you're filling out the 1023-EZ. There is a lot of information that will be required if you're filling out the full Form 1023 application. In our resource index, we also have a webinar about the 1023-EZ specifically, if folks end up at that step. And then on a continual basis, you'll update the IRS on your activities, including whether and how they further your exempt purposes on your annual Form 990 filing. So there are a lot of places where your tax-exempt mission or purpose will show up. So this is something that founders need to start to think about right at the outset and have a really clear idea of what their mission and purpose is going to be. Here's an example of what an exempt purpose clause might look like in your articles and bylaws. So as one of the articles in our template articles, for example, we have this kind of statement, the purpose for which the organization is organized are as follows, and then we'll articulate a exempt purpose description. And then we'll also have a sort of catch-all B point that will say, okay, we're going to do the specific thing that we talk about in A, but we might also engage in any other religious, charitable, scientific, or educational purpose within the meaning of the Internal Revenue Code. So that's sort of our two-part approach. Our general drafting tip for your purpose clause is you want to articulate it to be specific enough to communicate your mission and activities to stakeholders. So that includes the IRS as it's reviewing your application for tax-exempt status. But your mission clause will also be seen potentially by funders, by the general public. It's on your Form 990s. It'll be on online databases related to your organization many times. So you want to make sure that it is concise, punchy, that it gets across what your organization is trying to do. At the same time, especially as you're founding or creating the organization, you want to make sure that the purpose clause is general enough to accommodate changing activities or focus areas or constituencies or geographic focuses over time. So give yourself flexibility to evolve your organization without having to go back and amend the purpose clause in your articles and bylaws every time you pivot or expand the scope of your organization. So for folks early in the formation process, that really means thinking about what you want to do in the next couple of years as your organization is getting off the ground, but also thinking a little bit more long term, what would sort of the first 10 years of our organization look like? What would be the mission and activities and goals that we would have for the organization in that sort of phase? All right. So what's guiding us here? So the Internal Revenue Code, Section 501, right in the code, defines the following valid exempt purposes. And ultimately, we need to fit the mission and the actual activities of our organization within one of these articulated exempt purposes. And they're listed here: charitable, religious, educational, scientific, testing for public safety, literary, fostering, amateur sports competitions, and prevention of cruelty to children or animals. The first three, I think, are the big ones: charitable, religious, and educational, and those are the ones that we'll focus on. We'll touch on the others later in this presentation. So again, as we're leaving the sort of legal background component of the presentation, I just want to emphasize that In order to maintain your tax-exempt status and obtain it in the first place, it's critical that you understand which one of these 8 categories your organization falls under and what might be the specific requirements or nuances of each category that we should be aware of and that we should navigate around when explaining our purpose to the IRS and to other stakeholders. All right, so let's get into the meat of things and start with the biggest and most relevant category for most folks, and that's going to be the charitable purposes category. The term charitable in this sense is a broad and evolving concept that changes with societal needs. There's a sort of traditional idea of charity, which is sort of helping the poor, but we have evolved, and today we take a much broader understanding of what charitable means. One core definition is any benevolent or philanthropic objective not prohibited by law or public policy, which tends to advance the well-doing and well-being of man. So that's a pretty broad category of activities. And so I think most founders will find themselves interested in the charitable category and should be poking around the various options that you have within this category. And actually other seemingly specialized purposes that you saw on that 8-part list, like educational organizations, religious organizations, scientific, literary, cruelty prevention, tend to overlap significantly with options that you have within this charitable purpose category. And so even for organizations that might think of themselves as educational or scientific or religious, the charitable option is often still the best classification for what they're trying to do. Those freestanding categories of educational or religious are often used in a narrower sense than what is available to you under the charitable category. So I'm expecting the vast majority of folks listening to this webinar will land in the charitable category at the end of the day. The IRS regulations explicitly recognize a range of charitable activity subcategories. In this presentation, we're going to organize and approach them in the following 6 subcategories. So this does not exactly track the way that the IRS categorizes or labels these subcategories, but I think it's a little more user-friendly to think about them this way. I think it's a little bit more modernized. A lot of these categories were developed in the 50s, 60s, 70s and use different terms than we use today. So this is the way that I'm going to go through them: assistance to needy individuals, promotion of health and wellness, promotion of social welfare, community and environmental stewardship, advancement of religion, and then advancement of arts, sciences, and education. Those are the 6 big categories of charitable activities that nonprofits can engage in as a 501c3 tax-exempt entity. Alrighty, so let's get into category 1, assistance to needy individuals. This is our first charitable subcategory. I think this is a kind of iconic and well understood category for a charity. It might be the quintessential kind of organization that we think of when we think of a charity. So this is a nonprofit that provides direct, tangible services or benefits to needy individuals or to a charitable class of qualified individuals. Thought of another way, we don't want wealthy and privileged individuals to be getting services like free food or free housing or legal services from nonprofit organizations on a tax-exempt basis, right? We want to limit those tangible services to people who really need the services, who can't afford them or who need access to them for another reason. Important to note that this includes both US and international beneficiaries. So internationally focused nonprofit organizations are 501c3s under the same rubric that we have for domestic organizations. And another thing to remember is that sometimes services and benefits that can be provided under another category, either in this charitable category or as a religious or educational organization. And in those cases, they don't necessarily need to be provided only to needy individuals. For example, educational services can be provided to anyone in most cases, and you can still be a 501c3 nonprofit. So we're really only talking about here certain tangible services like life necessities or other things, and we'll get into some examples. If you're going to be providing these valuable services that both poor people and rich people need and can access off the market, then we need to limit that to needy individuals or a charitable class. So let's define needy individuals. There's an IRS definition. It's a person who lacks the necessities of life involving physical, mental, or emotional well-being because of poverty or temporary distress. Okay, so specific examples from the IRS of needy individuals include low income, impoverished, or people lacking resources. And there's a sub-definition for low-income families, which sets it at 80% of AMI as a threshold that people can think of. We have people who are hungry, homeless, lacking food or shelter or a means to provide for themselves. We have victims of natural disasters, victims of civil disasters like wars or riots, and victims of violent crime, physical abuse, or some other significant personal crisis. That counts as a needy individual. Refugees or immigrants who are experiencing language, cultural, or financial difficulties. Again, this is a fun example because there are some refugees or some immigrants, certainly, who can be very wealthy and very well off and might not qualify for charitable services compared to other immigrants or refugees. That's a good example to think about. An orphaned minor child, or a former prisoner or former patient of a mental institution. We have reentry programs, for example, that might be operated on a nonprofit basis. I'm going to weave through this presentation some local examples. I serve on the selection committee of the Center for Nonprofits Board Leadership Award. So I've pulled in some award winners and finalists from the last 5 years as examples of organizations that fit in the various categories we'll talk about. Carpenter Shelter, a classic example. It's a homelessness organization providing shelter and housing along with guidance, education, and advocacy. So they're needy individuals or homeless or charitable class or homeless individuals. Very classic example. From a few years ago, we have a great DC organization called Food and Friends that delivers meals and medical nutrition therapy to folks in the district living with cancer, HIV, AIDS, and other serious illnesses, right? So you can't create a nonprofit that gives food to everyone, rich or poor, whether they need it or not. That will probably not qualify as a charitable organization, but if we're targeting it to a particular class of people who need the free food for a particular reason, often it's related to their economic situation, but see in this example, it's related to their living with a serious illness, that can qualify. Okay, I've used that term charitable class a few times. This is a group of needy individuals who are eligible for services from a nonprofit. So there's two kind of components to think about here. First, they must be needy, and the IRS provides some classic examples of groups of people who fit into this category, like the poor, the elderly, the sick or handicapped or disabled, disaster victims, or youth under 18. Sometimes it's sufficient just to provide services targeting the special needs of an entire group, and we'll see some examples there of organizations which broadly serve youth or serve the elderly. But sometimes when we're providing certain kind of really tangible benefits or targeted benefits, we have to limit it to certain subgroups within these categories. So for example, there are some organizations that provide really significant benefits to young people. We can't provide those to all youth. We need to provide them to youth who really need those benefits and can't afford them, for example. So there's that neediness component. And then another really important concept when we're talking about a charitable class is that it must be sufficiently large or indefinite so that at the end of the day, our nonprofit isn't formed to benefit a predetermined or pre-selected group of individuals. This speaks to a concept that we'll hear repeatedly throughout today, which is the concept of private benefit. Nonprofits can't be created to serve the interests of a small group of people or of specific individuals. So, some examples that we have of a large charitable class is a pool that's so large that potential beneficiaries cannot be independently identified, and that providing benefits to this group would benefit the entire community. So the entire city or an entire state or the whole country, the general public, that is a sufficiently large charitable class. It's possible to have smaller charitable classes, and we've seen examples where the nonprofit has allowed, where the IRS has allowed nonprofits to exist, which only serve a particular city block, or the employees of a particular company, or the members and alumni of a fraternity. But even in these cases, you have to allow new beneficiaries to be added over time or in different situations so that there is theoretically a potentially infinite number of future beneficiaries. As long as there's that indefinite number of beneficiaries going into the future, we can't accuse the founder of creating the nonprofit to kind of benefit themselves and their friends today, right? That's really what we're worried about. A nonprofit that's created today with the express purpose of helping out my friends and my relatives or my neighborhood, but the people that I know versus an indefinite class of people in the community. And we'll get to some examples. Here's a kind of classic example, the YMCA. What does the YMCA do? I think a lot of us think of them as creating gyms or community centers. In its own words, the YMCA is committed to strengthening community by empowering young people, improving the health and well-being of people, and inspiring action across communities. So we'll see what one of the charitable classes that the YMCA is serving is youth. That's what the Y stands for in YMCA. And going into their 990, which is a great place to learn about the particular mission and activities of an organization. They talk about their youth development program. So this is inspiring people for civic engagement. It also provides support to millions of children through after-school programs, healthcare, Head Start programs, sports, swim lessons, and more. All right, so the YMCA, their charitable class is youth. And notice that they're not really limiting their services to a certain subgroup of youth, because these are generally useful services for all young people. Youth, broadly speaking, is their charitable class. If you go into the social responsibility component, it's also interesting. They have a immigrant support service that has supported 13.3 immigrants, including in the year of this report, Ukrainian arrivals. So we see another charitable class popping up here of immigrants that are served by the YMCA. Another good example to think about this is from an IRS guidance on disaster relief organizations, and they give you this great hypo. So Linda has a baby, Todd, who suffers burns in a fire requiring costly treatment that Linda can't afford. Linda's friends and coworkers formed the Todd Foundation to raise funds from fellow workers, family members, and the general public to support Todd. Because the organization is formed to assist a particular individual, it would not qualify as a charitable organization. And then in the rest of the example, what the IRS explains is what you can do is create a more general purpose disaster relief organization that helps all sorts of victims of a certain kind of disaster or various kinds of disaster. And then you could have Todd as one sort of qualified beneficiary within that program. And the folks who want to donate to that program can say, hey, I want to support Todd with this money. What the organization can say in that case is that the funds may be used to assist Todd, but at the end of the day, the organization is going to decide, A, whether Todd even qualifies for their program, and B, whether those contributions might be better used for other children who have similar needs. Okay, so we can't earmark the donations for Todd, but we can still give to this kind of organization and hope that it flows down to beneficiaries like Todd. That's what we can do within the structures of a 501c3 disaster relief organization. Okay, so let's get into some other examples of direct assistance programs. We have programs that provide basic food or necessities like clothing or housing or shelter, or critical services like legal services, medical services, counseling, credit counseling, childcare to low income or other needy individuals. And in this context, we can generate some service fees. We'll get into that in a minute. There are special rules for childcare organizations, for example, so just watch out. Note that some of these categories have additional rules and compliance burdens and burdens at the application stage. We can have what the IRS calls self-help programs. These are things like vocational training or job-related tools or materials to needy individuals. We can have programs focused on elders, people over the age of 62. These can be basically nursing homes or other residential facilities that provide housing and healthcare. They don't all have to be low income in this situation. The IRS recognizes that just caring for the elderly is a charitable purpose, but they do want these nursing homes run in a way where they're really focused on controlling costs and they have some sort of way to serve residents who can no longer pay their fees. So you have to do something in your nonprofit nursing home that distinguishes you from a for-profit nursing home. Since a majority of nursing homes in this country are for-profit, we want to see what do you do that's special or different, that's really focused on serving the community, that makes you different from a for-profit enterprise to justify receiving the tax benefits of being a nonprofit. There are also other programs that provide educational, recreational, or other targeted services for the specific needs of elderly individuals. That's fine. You can have programs that assist the sick or handicapped, like medical care, housing, or other critical services. Again, this is another example. There's a good IRS example of a nonprofit that upgrades people who need private hospital rooms, but can't afford private hospital rooms. This nonprofit basically pays to upgrade them into a private hospital room. The IRS says that's fine because these people need the hospital room, but they can't pay for it. You can't have a nonprofit that indiscriminately upgrades everyone into private hospital rooms, because then you might upgrade someone who doesn't need that support, and that could be a form of private benefit. Going back to some of our local board leadership award examples, here's Forest Hill of DC, a senior living facility that is a 501c3 nonprofit. Looking at their 990, what do? They provide long-term healthcare to their residents, and they also have a specialized Alzheimer's and dementia program. So Forest Hills doesn't look super different from a for-profit nursing home, but they do kind of focus on these programs. They're accessible to the broader community. They're focused on controlling costs, and there's actually a lot of good literature out there for people who are curious about how nonprofit nursing homes in particular do seem to have higher quality of care. They overcharge Medicare, Medicaid less, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some sort of structural benefits to operating that kind of organization as a nonprofit. Here's an example that people might be familiar with. This is Dress for Success. It provides a host of services to women trying to enter the workplace. One kind of iconic program for them is a suiting program where women can get a one-on-one consultation with a volunteer personal shopper and receive a free interview outfit, including a suit, blouse, shoes, pantyhose, and accessories. All right, so why can Dress for Success provide free clothing to women? Because the qualified women have to come through a referral agency. And basically, you have to go through another organization that kind of identifies you as someone who is in need of professional attire or workforce development support. All right, so another example of an organization that provides a direct benefit, but only to a certain class of individuals who particularly need that support. And finally, I think this is a good classic example of the Make-A-Wish Foundation. You know, if I told you there was an organization that flew kids off to Disney World for free, or created all these other amazing experiences, you might say, why is that a nonprofit? Well, it's because these kids have cancer or another critical illness, and they qualify and they're referred by a physician. All right, and the idea is that these wishes for these kids actually can improve their outcomes. It's really important for their community. It's important for the kids themselves. So that's why it's okay to have an organization like Make-A-Wish. Okay, that's our first biggest category. Let me go through some other categories in the charitable sphere that also qualify as charitable nonprofits. Nonprofits focus on the promotion of health are charitable nonprofits. You have a lot of, for example, nonprofit hospitals, clinics, and other direct providers of healthcare services, as long as they provide some sort of community scale benefit that distinguishes them from a for-profit hospital. So this is another sphere where there are a ton of for-profit entities basically providing the same services in the same communities. So if we're going to give a hospital tax-exempt status or a clinic tax-exempt status, it has to be doing something that's different and distinguishing from those, oops, I'm a little out of order, from those for-profit organizations. And in this case, in the case of hospitals, the IRS has something called a community benefit standard with a bunch of factors that we might look at to indicate that this organization isn't run exactly the same as a for-profit hospital, and that it does things that make it clear that it's focused on serving the community and not just making a lot of money by billing insurance companies and patients. So things like making the emergency room open to all, using surplus funds to improve patient care or to go into research, having financial assistance programs, etc. So, I know a lot of folks here aren't trying to create nonprofit hospitals, but I think this is a good framework to think about when we have a nonprofit enterprise that looks really similar to a for-profit enterprise. We need to be thinking about what we're doing differently in terms of our business model, in terms of the way that we provide services, in terms of how broadly we provide services that distinguish us from that for-profit analog. Want to note that we can have other health and wellness orgs that don't directly provide healthcare services, like health or disease-focused education, research, policy, and/or advocacy organizations. Those definitely promote health as a charitable purpose. Organizations focused on healthcare access or availability, organizations that support hospitals. This is another board leadership award example from a few years ago. It's the Primary Care Coalition. They don't provide health services, but they provide kind of coordinating services to improve the quality of care for people experiencing vulnerability. So making sure that vulnerable folks are linked into care and that they have coordinated care across the different providers that they might use. So this is a great example of a health promotion nonprofit that is not a service provider, but that still qualifies as a charitable organization. All right, that's health and kind of physical welfare. There's also a class of organizations that are charitable because they promote social welfare. So in this example, there's sort of two broad kind of categories. We have kind of community investment organizations, and these are the IRS's terms, organizations that lessen neighborhood tensions and organizations that combat community deterioration and juvenile delinquency. You can sort of get the vibe that these are from the 50s and 60s and 70s in this case in particular. We also have another kind of class that I call justice and legal advocacy organizations. These are organizations that eliminate prejudice and discrimination or defend human and civil rights secured by law. All right, so let me dive into those two big subclasses a little bit more. So community investment organizations, again, these are the organizations that focus on combating community deterioration or neighborhood tensions. And so they might do this by reducing poverty. They might do this through other initiatives that address the physical, economic, and social causes of either community deterioration or neighborhood tensions. In some cases, these economic development programs can confer what would look like a private benefit to either individuals or businesses because they can provide grants to individuals or businesses. They might do like kind of street or neighborhood development or beautification projects that improve certain homes or businesses, improve property values. In some senses, that is a private benefit, and we want to be really careful. But they're allowed in the case of these organizations because they are outweighed by the broader public benefits that are received by the public at large. So here's some examples. You might have an organization focused on issues like housing discrimination, housing availability, or housing affordability. A lot of these cases came in sort of the post-integration era, and a lot of them have to do with housing discrimination and integration. Today, I think we have other issues around housing discrimination, availability, and affordability. Organizations that actually provide either units of housing or loans to purchase housing or loans to repair homes for poor, disadvantaged homeowners in blighted or previously segregated neighborhoods. We have organizations that provide loans or other valuable support to small businesses in economically depressed areas, or orgs working to spur development in depressed or blighted areas, historical preservation organizations, and then research, education, advocacy orgs focused on community investment or development. Okay, so this is an interesting category. Has to do with the community at large and not less to do with individuals. And then juvenile delinquency is also kind of a stated purpose in the code or in the regulations. I'll give you some examples. This is a DC org called City First Enterprises. They basically give loans and capital, but also kind of consulting and expertise and technical assistance to folks who want to achieve racial, economic, and social equality by investing in housing, education, nonprofit, small businesses, and climate-focused initiatives. So they're a 501c3 nonprofit, and they do impact investing. And the idea is that investing, if we target the right folks, is going to help achieve racial, economic, and social equality. All right, so the purpose isn't exactly to help specific people start small businesses, for example. That is a good thing, but that's not really the mission of the organization. The mission is by investing in things like small businesses, we're going to achieve racial, economic, and social equality. So that is more in the language of the sort of community deterioration or fighting for equality, et cetera, that we see in the IRS regs. Another example, historic DuPont Main Streets. So this is one of many Main Streets that we have, Main Street organizations that we have here in DC. They focus on commercial revitalization, educating businesses, promoting businesses, improving the value of commercial building owners. They have like a street volunteer cleanup program. So we have a historic DuPont is kind of a historical site, and we just want to kind of maintain and improve the qualities of that site. All right, so that is another sort of community investment type organization. I want to note that the Main Street programs are embedded in a broader DC government initiative. So, you know, DC DuPont Main Streets is not operating in a vacuum. It's sort of aligned with other public initiatives. And I want to contrast that with an older IRS case So this was like an association that was formed to preserve the traditions, architectural style, and scenic appearance of a historic community. The voting membership was restricted to owners of real estate in the community. And the IRS ultimately found that while preserving a historic or scenic area for the benefit of the general public is charitable, preserving the tradition, architecture, and appearance of a community for the benefit solely of residents is not charitable. All right, so that was a critical distinction. That the focus of this proposed nonprofit was really the homeowners in the area wanting to maintain what they thought the look of the area should be. And the IRS was like, that is not enough of a public benefit to grant you 501c3 status. I don't want to contrast that with something like a Main Street program, which is really about economic development and neighborhood development, but it's not limited to certain residents, and the benefits sort of flow freely across the neighborhood and across the city as a whole. All right, another category, a subcategory here are justice and legal advocacy organizations in the social welfare space. So these are social welfare organizations that either eliminate prejudice and discrimination or defend human and civil rights. So we might have research, education, and advocacy organizations focused on discrimination, equality, or protecting legal rights. We also might have legal organizations that more directly perform legal education or provide legal services or engage in impact litigation around eliminating prejudice and discrimination and or defending legal rights. All right, so one of our board leadership examples, Network for Victim Recovery, DC, this is a legal services organization that serves survivors of crime, specifically survivors of violent crime or other crimes, and they provide a host of legal services. I think they're a good example because we can think of legal services as being for poor or indigent clients. That's very common in our space. Here's one that focuses on a slightly different client population. All right, so that was the social welfare category. We have two more left in this charitable mega category. Let's talk about community environmental stewardship. One classic category of organizations that we see in IRS regulations are those that lessen the burdens of government. So to qualify as an organization that lessens the burdens of government, the organization must actually relieve a burden that the government itself has expressed that it has and that it would like relieved, and the organization actually has to go in and relieve that, or the organization itself has to qualify as an instrumentality of the government. So examples might include volunteer fire, rescue, and other emergency services. These are citizens operating civic services that are valuable. Crime prevention or police EMS, police fire EMS support organizations. So not actually providing the services directly, but supporting them financially or through other means. Technical assistance or research or accreditation organizations that target government functions like traffic safety or public transit or crime and are coordinated with or funded by governmental units. There's a lot of examples about like supplemental transit programs that fill gaps in the public transit system. So okay, it's a kind of narrow category of organizations, but can have some interesting, robust examples from our board leadership from a couple years ago. For example, we have the Friends of Montgomery Library. So it's a 501c3 nonprofit that supports the Montgomery Public Libraries by fundraising and creating programs, etc., raising awareness of the library. So that's an example. Another category of organizations in this sort of community stewardship category is the creation of public works or facilities. Again, the IRS expressly recognizes the erection of public buildings, facilities, monuments, or works as a charitable activity. Just by creating an amenity or a facility that's accessible to the public at large, that is in and of itself a charitable activity. We don't have to dig too deep into whether it's religious or educational, etc. So for example, public parks, recreational facilities, tree planting or other beautification projects, public art installations, etc. The key here, again, as we've seen in many examples, is that there's community-wide availability and benefit and a lack of private benefit. So we can't have, for example, facilities that are provided on some sort of discriminatory basis, and we can't have facilities that disproportionately benefit or are accessible to a small group of residents or to a specific community. If we're going to be a charity under this category, the things that we're doing have to be accessible to and benefit the public at large. Here's another local example. We have the Friends of Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens. The aquatic gardens are a national park, actually, and this nonprofit works in coordination with the National Park Service to maintain the park. All right, that's a great classic example. Here's an example of something that wasn't allowed in a case out of the late 1980s, and it's a fun blast from the past. So there was a Columbia Park and Recreation Association that tried to become a 501c3 nonprofit for the purpose of operating extensive recreational facilities in Columbia, Maryland, which at the time was a newly constructed model community from a private developer. The association argued that it would create all of these parks and recreational facilities. They would be open to non-residents if they paid an admission fee, but the admission fee that non-residents would pay was not as advantageous as the fee arrangements that residents would engage in. And because of this discrimination, this discrepancy, the tax court ultimately said the association could not be a nonprofit because it had that kind of discriminatory effect between residents and non-residents. So hammering home again the idea that if we're going to have a nonprofit engaged in public facilities or works, that they really do have to be publicly available. Okay. All right, let me get through a few more other sub-examples. We have environmental organizations. This for me is a little bit more self-explanatory. Environmental conservation is charitable, to the extent that it creates really broad public benefits, maybe even on a global scale. So examples might include environmental advocacy, wildlife conservation, resource conservation, land trusts or preservation societies that preserve ecologically or publicly significant land, horticultural associations, etc. Okay. Let's go into purpose 5 in the charitable purpose mega category, so advancement or promotion of religion. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that's weird. I thought religion was its own separate category. Why is it also a charitable activity? That's a great question. The Revenue Code does establish religious organizations as tax exempt. That organization is generally referring to churches and other organizations that directly provide religious services. So yes, mosques, synagogues, temples, etc., but also other like associations of churches or organizations that sort of engage in that service. Religious organizations in the charitable category are those that advance or promote religion. So these are charitable organizations that are not technically churches, but they might advance religion by publishing religious newsletters or other publications. They might be things like youth groups or other enterprises that are associated or related to a religious organization, but that focus on slightly different aims. Also like things like retreats. A counterexample, though, is I saw a cool case where an organization wanted to provide wintertime ocean cruises that did have some religious and educational content, but the IRS eventually said, well, it's outweighed by the social and recreational content of these cruises, and we're not going to let you create a nonprofit cruise line, basically, that can compete with for-profit cruise companies without having to pay taxes. Religious food certification organizations like kosher or halal certification organizations, organizations providing burial services within a religiously significant context. Another example of an organization that would compete directly against for-profit burial companies, but as long as they're doing it with a real focus on adherence to religious requirements or serving a particular religious community, they're really promoting religion and can operate that kind of business as a tax-exempt nonprofit. Okay, finally, charities that advance the arts, sciences, and education. So advancement of science and education is explicitly identified as charitable in the Internal Revenue Code. There's a category for scientific organizations, there's a category for educational organizations, but there's also the possibility of being a charity that advances arts, sciences, and education. We can do this through things like scholarship programs. Now, we can have need-based scholarships that are charitable in the sense that we're really assisting needy individuals like low-income folks or folks that are disadvantaged. But we can also have scholarships that are based on achievement or excellence or the potential community impact of a scholar. And that is charitable for a different reason. That's charitable because investing in these individuals advances science or education or whatever field they want to go in. So it's also charitable to support those kind of folks, even if they don't have financial need, because just investing in their excellence and their potential is a recognized charitable purpose. We can have organizations that support art, science, or education orgs, things like college bookstores that provide a sort of supplementary service, organizations that provide technical assistance or that are focused on policy, training, enrichment, etc. in arts, science, or education. We can have arts organizations themselves are in this category, things like theaters, art galleries, film festivals, media companies that have an educational focus or kind of more publicly focused mission. And we're going to see some examples where that's contrasted with a for-profit commercial arts or media enterprise. And yeah, let me get into this last point, which is related. We can have things like medical journals, scientific journals, arts magazines, etc. But again, they have to really have an express focus on advancing the field of arts, sciences, and educations, and can't be operated on a traditionally commercial basis. So you can't have a nonprofit media company or publication series that's really driven by maximizing your circulation and generating revenue versus advancing a more nuanced public-facing mission. Let me give you some examples of that down the road. But here's an example of a more traditional advancement of education nonprofit. This is one of our board leadership finalists, Outteach. They use sort of outdoor learning labs to inspire children, and they teach teachers how to use outdoor education. Okay, great example. We have Imagination Stage, a local theater company that empowers young people to discover their voice and identity through performing arts. Great example. Let me get into some examples of those nonprofit media organizations. And I think a fun one is Science Magazine versus Nature Magazine. They're both well-regarded sort of science publications, but whereas Cell and Nature are owned by large for-profit publishing conglomerates, Science is actually published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science and is a nonprofit publishing enterprise. So this is in Science's kind of own words. The revenue that they generate does not go to corporate shareholders. Rather, it goes back into AAAS to advocate for science, to provide policy expertise, etc. So the funds from the publishing advance other nonprofit goals, and the publication itself, Science, is educational and advances science. Another example is the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, is published by the American Medical Association, which is a nonprofit, versus the Lancet, which is a for-profit medical publication. All right, both very highly regarded. One is nonprofit, one is for-profit. Another example in the sphere of journalism, we can think of an organization like ProPublica versus the New York Times. ProPublica publishes journalism and can look very similar to something like the New York Times, but they have a real narrow focus. They focus on in-depth investigative journalism that sheds light on abuses of power and betrayals of public trust. And because that kind of journalism in particular is very expensive, a lot of commercial media organizations are not investing as much in in-depth investigative journalism. The New York Times, for example, has investigative journalism, but they also have opinion pages and editorials and the style section and games and its cooking chapter. So, you know, it's focused on creating a media company that's going to generate revenue and that engages readers in a broader kind of way. ProPublica is really focused on a narrow sort of media story that has broader public value. Let me check the questions really quick. I see some specific questions about specific organizations. I'm going to have to save those for later, just in case we run out of time. Let's keep going. We have left the charitable space. We have, you know, a little bit of time left to touch on the other categories in the code. There is, again, a freestanding category for religious organizations. And here we're really thinking if we're going to seek exemption in this category versus the charitable category, it's really because, oops, we're thinking of things like churches, synagogues, temples, mosques, or organizations that really directly provide religious services, or affiliated organizations like seminaries, etc. You know, an important note about churches in particular, and synagogues, mosques, etc., is that due to constitutional concerns, they're treated a little bit differently. Churches do not have to file a 1023 form to be recognized as a 501c3 organization, and they also don't have to file annual 990s, for example. So if you are a church and you want to kind of reap some of those unique benefits, you want to be exempt in this religious category instead of as a charity that advances religion. The IRS takes a pretty hands-off approach when it comes to figuring out whether someone's a church or not. There is some case law that talks about like 15 factors, I think, that the IRS can look to if it's unsure whether an organization is a church or not a church. But broadly speaking, you know, we don't want to get involved in regulating religion because of the First Amendment. So the IRS generally takes a pretty hands-off approach. Okay, that's the religious category. Let's talk about educational nonprofits. Again, you'll remember that advancing or promoting education is a charitable purpose, and a lot of educational organizations end up being classified as charities or seek a classification as a charity. But there is also a freestanding category for educational organizations that's available to you. This category is divided into some subcategories. Schools, so basically organizations that focus on the instruction or training of individuals. So this can be primary, secondary, colleges, professional schools, trade schools. It can be distance learning programs. We also have educational nonprofits that educate the broader public on subjects useful to the individual and beneficial to the community. This can be things like museums, zoos, planetaries, and orchestras that the IRS looks at too as examples. They can also be organizations that educate the public on broader topics via things like discussion groups, forums, panels, lectures, published broadcast or online media, or other similar programs. All right, so these are kind of more publicly facing, kind of issue specific, typically educational nonprofits. Here's some local board leadership finalist examples of both categories. So 826 DC helps students learn writing skills and has a host of kind of in-school and after-school and affiliated programs all about improving writing skills for students. That's a good example of an educational nonprofit, although it would probably also easily qualify as a charitable nonprofit that advances education. There was a finalist a few years ago called ISPU, Institute for Policy Understanding, I think is the acronym, and they provide research and education about American Muslims to support well-informed dialogue and decision-making. A great example of an education nonprofit that's more focused on public education than it is like a school that trains individuals on a specific skill or program. Let me see if we have a question here. Okay. There's one nuance here that I want to touch on, which is the IRS has some guardrails around when advocacy counts as education. So the big takeaway here is that nonprofits can advocate for their own particular position or viewpoint on a topic and still be conducting exempt public educational activities. All right, so like ISPU in that last slide definitely has its own perspective and viewpoints on the topics that it educates the public about. That's fine, but the IRS does require these kinds of advocacy organizations to provide a sufficiently full and fair exposition of the facts to permit individuals or the public to form an independent opinion or conclusion. On the flip side, or in contrast, the IRS does not think it's educational to merely present unsupported opinion as sort of the primary activity of your nonprofit. There are some factors that the agency has looked at to see if an organization is truly educational. So these are bad factors that would imply that it might not be. If the presentation of viewpoints or positions are unsupported by facts, if the facts that the nonprofit is relying on are distorted, if the organization's presentation makes substantial use of inflammatory or disparaging terms, and expresses conclusions more on the basis of strong emotional feelings than of objective evaluations, or if the approach used in the organization's presentation is not aimed at developing an understanding because it does not consider the audience's background or training. So these are some examples of factors which might stop you from being classified as an educational nonprofit. Okay. So we've done charitable, we've done religious, we've done educational. Let me touch very briefly on the other nonprofits in the Internal Revenue Code, other purposes in the list of the Internal Revenue Code. You might have seen scientific up there. As usual, advancement of science is as a charitable activity, and a lot of scientific organizations can be classified as charities. But there is a freestanding category also for scientific organizations, really focused on scientific research organizations that operate in the public interest. All right, so again, these are research institutions that make their findings available to the public on a non-discriminatory basis. They might perform the research for the US government or a government agency or a state. Or there might be some other factor that makes it clear that the reason this organization exists is to conduct research in the public interest, like it is connected to a college or university, it publishes its findings, it's for the purpose of curing a disease, or it's for the purpose of aiding a community in kind of a certain geographical area, some broader public purpose. The contrast here is with scientific research organizations that are conducted really for commercial interests, to support a company to develop new products, for example, or for some sort of industrial interest. That sort of scientific research the IRS does not want to recognize as a tax-exempt enterprise because it's connected to industry or to companies. There are literary organizations. These are really largely going to be subsumed in either the educational or charitable category. There are some rules around nonprofit publishing organizations. The basic takeaway is that since there are so many for-profit publishing organizations, if you're going to be a nonprofit publishing or media organization, you have to be doing something a little bit different in terms of your business model and in terms of your commitment to advancing a certain charitable or educational mission. We saw some of those examples back there with ProPublica or with the Science Journal. There's a category for organizations that are fostering amateur sports competition. So this is not the Olympics. These are amateur competitions at a sub kind of pro level, kind of an interesting little small category there. Organizations that test consumer products for public safety, and organizations focused on the prevention of cruelty to children or animals. That last category, again, a lot of the time you can subsume these activities as a charitable activity. So I don't see a lot of organizations looking to this category as a freestanding basis for tax-exempt status. All right, and the last thing that we'll do while we have a few minutes left is let's just review some of the guardrails or prohibitions or important considerations that we see through some of these examples for what the IRS will not allow in terms of a nonprofit mission or purpose. First and foremost, and this is sort of self-explanatory, the nonprofit does not allow nonprofits to be formed that are created to facilitate, advocate, or condone illegal actions or actions that violate fundamental public policies. There's a very famous case, the Bob Jones case. This was a religious and educational institution that had a policy that forbade interracial dating. And so the IRS is like, look, we can recognize you as a religious organization and you can have those beliefs, but we're not going to give you C3 status because we have a strong public policy against racial discrimination and you violate that policy. So your beliefs are not illegal, but that doesn't mean we have to grant you 501c3 status. There's another example of an anti-war organization that encouraged members to commit acts of civil disobedience. That organization was also denied tax-exempt status. Okay, that's easy. Another recurring theme that we've heard through the hour are activities resulting in private benefit or private inurement. There have been many examples that we've covered where the IRS draws a line against activities that would disproportionately benefit private individuals versus creating some sort of public benefit. So again, when we're providing goods and services, it has to be to needy individuals or to a charitable class. When we have a charitable class, it has to be large and indefinite. It can't be a group of pre-selected individuals. When we have programs that might benefit private businesses, there has to be some sort of overriding charitable purpose like historical preservation or fighting community deterioration. When we have programs focused on creating and maintaining public facilities, they have to truly be for the general public and they can't disproportionately benefit certain stakeholders or residents, etc. If we have scholarships, fellowships, and grants, they have to either be need-based or they have to advance science and education in some more general way. And when we have that example of nonprofit scientific research organizations, they have to conduct that research for the public benefit and not for the overriding benefit of like corporate or private interests. All right, so we've seen a ton of examples. I just want to bring up a related concept, which is the concept of private inurement. These are situations where nonprofit leaders can influence the nonprofit to advance their own personal interests. Another common related term you'll hear is self-dealing. Nonprofits cannot engage in private inurement or self-dealing. There are penalties involved and it can jeopardize your 501c3 tax-exempt status. So for example, if I'm the leader of a nonprofit, if I'm on the board, or I'm an officer of the nonprofit, or I'm a key employee of the nonprofit, I can't use my position and my power to select myself or my relatives as beneficiaries of the nonprofit's programs itself. We can't hire myself or my relatives as paid personnel. We can't we can't create arrangements where I pay my own companies or associated companies as a vendor for goods, services, etc. So we have a lot of resources around navigating conflicts of interest and avoiding private inurement. I just want to flag it here because a common question that I get are founders who want to create nonprofits really because they want to partner that nonprofit with a company that they already own or that they might be affiliated with. For example, I want to create a nonprofit that exclusively uses the counseling services of my for-profit mental health, therapy outfit, or the educational materials that I create through a for-profit company. Even if you do that on extremely advantageous terms for the nonprofit and its clients or constituents, these can still result in private benefit or private inurement and can be denied tax-exempt status or can cause you to lose tax-exempt status. So the tip here is really do not hinge your nonprofit's existence on a partnership with a pre-selected for-profit enterprise. You might ultimately be able to use those entities as vendors or partners, but the board of directors at the time will sort of need to conduct a case-by-case analysis and determine whether that partnership is in the best interest of the organization, and all the conflicted leaders, so the people who have a stake in both the nonprofit and the kind of for-profit partner organization, have to remove themselves from that deliberation and voting process. So there is a way to create these partnerships, but we can't have it baked into our nonprofits, articles and bylaws and just the DNA of our organization that we exist to use the services of XYZ company. That's not going to work. Another ongoing theme we've seen are our commercial activities. So nonprofits can generate their own income through fees or charges within the scope of their charitable program. However, they cannot engage in what we call unrelated business activity or create enterprises that are fundamentally kind of indistinguishable from for-profit companies operating in the same space. We've seen this example with nonprofit hospitals versus for-profit hospitals, nonprofit media versus for-profit media. So we have an in-depth guide on generating revenue as a nonprofit. I'm going to leave that resource to kind of speak to itself. But basically, the main questions you want to be asking at the sort of founding or strategy stage is, if there is revenue generating activity, is it substantially related to advancing my mission or purpose? There was an example, for example, of a church that had just a big for-profit publishing arm. It didn't publish religious books, it just published anything, it made money, and then the money went back to the church. That is not going to qualify as a program related business. And the money that the church gets from that enterprise has to be taxed, and the church can't devote too much of its mission or activities or time or resources into kind of fostering that for-profit business. So that's one question you have to ask is the revenue generating activity itself related to my mission and purpose? And then two, kind of zooming out a little bit, is my business model different from an analogous for-profit enterprise? All right, so that webinar on UBIT is super useful here. I couldn't not put in my Girl Scouts example. This is an example of our local Girl Scouts chapter. They have $17 million in total revenue, $13 million from selling cookies. If I were Nabisco or another cookie company, I might wonder why the Girl Scouts are allowed to sell cookies on a tax-free basis, undermining my profits and my business. Well, it's because selling Girl Scout cookies is part of a broader program around leadership, life lessons, and entrepreneur skills for girls. So it fits within the Girl Scouts' broader charitable mission, which is really about empowering girls. Okay. And then last little point that I want to emphasize. So we heard above that nonprofits can advocate as an educational activity, as long as it's not, as long as there's kind of factual basis and that there's some balance to how they're presenting the information. I just want to flag that there are also limits around the amount of lobbying that nonprofits can do, and a categorical bar for 501c3s on political intervention. So lobbying is advocacy that is for or against legislation, and political intervention is advocacy for or against candidates for public office. That's an important concept for folks to understand. Again, we have a whole section of our website about nonprofit advocacy and lobbying, so I would encourage folks to check that out. All right, well, thanks. We're a couple of minutes over, but thank you all for attending the webinar today. If you have specific questions, my email address is here. We have our nonprofit resource library there at lawhealth.org/DC/NPSB. What you'll also find on that page are links to our upcoming events and links to our recurring brief advice services, including weekly office hours that you can sign up with me or other volunteer attorneys, and our small business clinic, which also provides some support. We also have a microsite collecting all of our starting a nonprofit resources. So I think especially the audience for this webinar will want to be aware of that microsite and check out the range of resources available there. All right, thanks again for attending today. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day, and I hope to see you at a future educational webinar. Take care.